It gave me the best feeling I'd had in weeks. We had clearly blindsided them. "I'd like to talk to the kids for a while before I make a ruling," the judge said, turning to the booth. The knot in my stomach had doubled in size and was now doing somersaults. The judge talked to the kids for about 20 minutes, and when they came out, they looked confused and unsure. But then they saw me and waved. I smiled and waved back, which made them both smile. They stopped and hugged their mother before walking out of the courtroom. Making a custody decision when both parents love their children is the most difficult part of this job, the judge began. When I have to favor one parent over the other, it is extremely painful. However, in the end, I have to do what is best for the children. The judge paused for a moment, pulling a piece of paper out of a folder. I looked across the courtroom and saw the smiles on the faces of Jenny, Brad, and Mr. Silas. My heart dropped into my stomach. She was going to win again. "As I said, I have to act in the best interest of the children," the judge began again. "In this case, I had to consider that both parents could provide for the children, allow them to go to the same school, and have the same marital status. The deciding factor was what the children wanted. After talking to them, I learned that they wanted to spend time with both parents. Therefore, I am granting joint custody to Glenda and Mark Wilson. The children will spend 2 weeks with each parent. The agreement will begin this Sunday, and since the children are already with Mrs. Wilson, she will stay with them for the first 2 weeks after this Sunday. Mr. Wilson will pick up the children as their homes are only 5 or 10 minutes from each other. This will not be difficult for either parent. The transfer will take place no later than 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon every 2 weeks. Are there any other questions?" When no one said anything, the judge announced that the divorce would be final in 30 days and tapped the gavel. An agreement had already been reached on the division of property. Everything would be split 50-50ths, and the house was up for sale and should sell pretty quickly. After all expenses, Jenny and I would each get $6,000. I'm sure it was pennies to Jenny, but to me, it would be an extra amount if I needed it. I was beyond jubilant but wanted to pretend that this was the expected outcome. Walking out into the hallway, I hugged the kids, then I headed over to where Jenny and Brad were berating Mr. Silas about the judge's decision. Mr. Silas tried unsuccessfully to explain that there was nothing he could do. "Sorry, Jenny," I said with a smirk. "I'm sorry to interrupt your tirade, but I wanted to clarify when I can pick up the kids. 2 weeks from Sunday? That's not the end of it." Brad growled. "Whatever, Brad," I said dismissively. "I just want to know when I can pick up the kids. I don't want to be charged with trespassing." "If you want, we can meet at a neutral location like McDonald's," the judge said. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's the way it's going to be until our lawyers overturn the ruling, Jenny snarled. "You're really getting to the bottom of the barrel." "I mean, marrying Miss Piggy to get joint custody," Brad sneered. That last remark was completely inappropriate and it made me angry, so I pounced on it. "You're just a chatterbox. You're marrying your grandfather, you little," yelled Brad. "Go outside and I'll beat you to the sidewalk," I said calmly. I wasn't going to fight Brad. He was taller than me by 3 inches and weighed about 30 pounds more. Nevertheless, I was pissed about everything, so I piled on top of him. "Don't you need to go to the car first to get your cane?" Brad lunged at me, but I jumped back before he could reach me. Jenny must have seen what the situation could turn into and grabbed Brad's arm at the same time. Mr. Silas stepped between us. "Mr. Cole Wilson, please," he pleaded. "If you attack Mr. Wilson, the court can grant him sole custody of the children. Please, Brad," Jenny pleaded. Suddenly, I realized that my 2 children were clinging to my leg and yelling to Brad, "Don't hurt our daddy." Jenny glared at me, but then turned her attention back to the kids. "It's okay, kids. Mr. Carlson and Daddy were just fooling around. Why don't we go get some ice cream?" As they were leaving, I turned to Jenny. "I'll be there at 2 p.m. 2 weeks from Sunday." Jenny only threw me a glance, but I didn't say or do anything else. At the appointed time, I picked up the kids, and we went to a movie and dinner with Miss Darla. Brad's lawyers were unable to cancel anything. The kids were thrilled to have me living on the ranch with Miss Darla. They went horseback riding all the time and loved cooking at Darla's place. When Jenny and I got married, I did almost everything myself. Jenny had trouble boiling water. 30 days after the judge's ruling, Darla and I were married at the courthouse with the children present. Darla's best friend stepped in for her, and Tom stepped in for me. After the ceremony, I kissed Darla on the lips. Her face reflected pure joy. A week after Darla and I were married, Jenny and Brad's wedding was all over the society papers. Jenny looked as happy as she could possibly be. However, the happiness on my children's faces struck me to the core. It wasn't fair, but as the weeks went by, it seemed to me that Tom's prediction that the pain would eventually subside would never come true. Even though some days the pain wasn't as sharp, my nights were filled with loneliness and agony. For the first 6 months, I kept trying to think of a way to get revenge, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't think of anything that I wouldn't go to jail for. How could I hurt a man whose fortune was estimated at several $100 million? And what could I do to Jenny? Tell her parents? They already knew, and Jenny didn't care. And yet, it hurt a lot because every picture I saw in the newspaper had a woman in it, radiant and happy. She had a career and left me in the dust. In my darkest moments, I considered poisoning my children's minds about their mother, but I loved them too much to do something like that. My pain remained acute, and what made it even worse was that my children seemed content with the new order of things. And I couldn't blame them because, truth be told, they had the best of both worlds. They saw their mother and father regularly. My kids told me how wonderful everything was at Brad's house. They raved about the pool, the hot tub, the game room, the tennis court, and the big screen TVs in every room. In Brad's house, he even had a mini movie studio with a popcorn machine. About 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Jenny changed the peaceful rules we had been following. She began trying to manipulate Glenda and Mark against me. Jenny subtly implied that I was a bad father because I didn't spend as much money on them as Brad did. When they told me this, I was filled with sadness and anger. When Darla found out about it, she was furious. She insisted that we sit the kids down and talk to them. So the next time they came back for 2 weeks, I sat them down at the kitchen table and asked, "Do you guys think I'm a bad dad because I don't spend as much money on you as Brad and Mom do?" "That's what Mom says." Mark replied uncertainly, "Mark, son, Mr. Carlson is a very, very rich man. That's why your mom decided to marry him. I can't afford to buy you everything they can buy you. You see, compared to Mr. Carlson, I'm a very poor man. All I can do is love you boys and tell you that if all these presents are important to you, I won't make you come to the ranch anymore." Glenda began to cry. "No, Daddy, I don't want to be with Mommy all the time. I want to be with you too." "Me neither," Mark said, and tears came to his eyes. I don't know what the kids said to Jenny when they got back to her, but it pissed her off, and she rushed over to the ranch. "Why the hell are Mark and Glenda mad at me for picking on their poor daddy?" she snapped at me when I opened the door. I wasn't going to get into an altercation with her, so I just said, "Back off, Jenny." Then I slammed the door in her face. That was just the beginning. Jenny began planning special trips for the kids over the next 2 weeks. The first was a trip to Disneyland. Of course, they wanted to go and begged me until I gave in. Jenny started doing it every 3rd month or so, and it was really frustrating for me. It was Darla who gave me the idea on how to get out of the situation with Jenny. The next time they came to me wanting to go to New York, I told them it was okay, we would just switch weeks. When Jenny said no, the kids were upset with her, not me. Point in favor of the good guys. It was a very stressful and depressing time in my life. Luckily for me, I had great support. Darla was always there to pick me up when I started to give up, but I also had 2 other allies, John and Elma Smith. Yes, Jenny's parents became my staunch allies. When Jenny married Brad, she didn't even invite her own parents to the wedding. She was embarrassed of them and didn't want her parents to ruin her special day. When I found out about it, I invited them to the ranch the same day as the wedding for a barbecue. Darla insisted that John and Elma stay the weekend. We had a great time with them, and I learned that John had been a soldier in Vietnam. He was wounded 3 times, but survived the war. He came home partially disabled, which limited his ability to work. It wasn't that he couldn't do the job, but employers looked at his 3 missing fingers and the scars on his face and decided he would be a liability. I was so impressed when Elma told me that he was awarded 3 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and a Silver Star. This man was a true hero, and Jenny was embarrassed by him. I think it was at that point that my feelings for Jenny began to fade. From then on, we usually invited them over at least one weekend when the kids were with me. Jenny refused to invite her parents to her new home or visit them in theirs. The way Jenny treated her parents broke my heart. At least Mark and Glenda got to know their grandparents through visits to the ranch. And here's another thing I learned. John grew up on a cattle ranch before Vietnam. He was a real cowboy. John even convinced me to start learning to ride. It opened up a whole different world for me in dealing with kids. As the months went by, I read many books on divorce and co-parenting. One piece of advice I stumbled upon proved to be very valuable. The author suggested that instead of buying the kids things, gift them with experiences. And Darla was imaginative in coming up with things to do. We visited all the local attractions, went hiking, bowling, and even played miniature golf. Many times, Darla even partnered with a local charity league to put on a mini rodeo, and to make it even more fun for the kids, she involved them in the planning. Glenda and Mark were excited to see their first rodeo, especially when they learned they would be leading the parade through town. However, Jenny tried to sabotage the rodeo by offering to take the kids to Disneyland in California, but Mark and Glenda flatly refused their mother. They didn't want to miss their first rodeo ever, and it was so successful that it has been an annual event ever since. During the first year after the divorce, Jenny continued to try to win the children's affection. She never stopped making snide remarks about me. From time to time, she convinced the kids to give up a few days with me to do something with her and Brad. And yet, even though I felt bad every time the kids chose to spend time with their mother over me, I never put them on notice. And every night they were with me, I continued to read 2 books before bed. Of course, as they got older, I had to read the books chapter by chapter, and I read a few chapters each night. This continued until 5th grade. Even though we didn't sleep together, living with Darla was very pleasant. She was fun to be with, for her disposition was always cheerful and kind. And by working in her den, I was able to grow my accounting business. At the end of the first year, I was earning about 70% of the salary I had earned working for Brad. Nevertheless, even a year after the divorce, Jenny was still trying to surpass me in the eyes of the children. By this time, however, Brad realized that I would never let him adopt my children. After realizing this, he began to lose interest in them. He was still kind and friendly with them, but they were just other people's kids. Brad began to monopolize more and more of Jenny's time. Brad wanted Jenny with him when he went overseas. If she had 2 weeks to have the kids, they traveled with them. At first, I was against Glenda and Mark leaving the country. I had heard horror stories of spouses kidnapping children and fleeing to a country where there was no extradition. Jenny continued to insist that I allow the children to go on their first trip abroad. Darla convinced me that even though Brad was a creep, he couldn't afford the scandal that kidnapping my children would cause. In the end, I agreed. Glenda and Mark were thrilled with the trip and talked about it for days. Several more trips followed, during which the children traveled abroad with their mother. One day, Brad's trip had to be extended, and I figured Jenny would just leave the kids with her. But instead, she called me and put the kids on a flight home, where I met them at the airport. The first anniversary of the divorce passed unnoticed by me. It wasn't until Tom called me one day to see how I was doing that I realized my wedding anniversary had passed, and I hadn't even mentioned it to Darla. And in that moment, I had to admit that Tom was right. Almost all the pain, loneliness, and anger were gone. Every now and then, there was some pain, but for the most part, Jenny was just an unpleasant memory. However, I felt very guilty for not getting Darla anything for our anniversary. I realized it wasn't a real marriage, but Darla was so supportive. So, I gave her flowers and took her out to dinner. I didn't give it much thought, but Darla was radiant for days afterward. However, closer to 18 months, Darla seemed to become moody. She was never unpleasant, but I could see that she was upset. I decided I had already exhausted my resources and began looking for a new place to live. Even though custody wasn't much of a problem these days, I wasn't going to take any chances. I searched for a long time until I found a townhouse to rent. It had 3 bedrooms and 2 baths. It also had a 1-car garage, but most importantly, it was located in the Chesterton School District. I really didn't want to move. I loved living on the ranch, and running my business from my room was perfect. Plus, I really enjoyed Darla's company until the last few weeks. She was always happy and cheerful. On my advice, Darla expanded the ranch. She purchased 200 more acres of mostly rocky hills. The trails on these hills were especially enjoyed by those who didn't want to just ride in the corral. It was a great place for groups to get away for a weekend of riding, sleeping, and outdoor cooking. It was a favorite spot for corporations hosting team-building weekends. I then convinced Darla to start offering summer camps for kids. They became hugely popular, and Darla had to hire additional people to run them. Darla then built a dozen cabins for adults who wanted to work on a real horse ranch. I helped organize the financing for this project. The business that was barely supporting Darla's life was now bringing her almost $200,000 a year after taxes. My business had grown so large that I used a den and a utility room. I had a secretary and bookkeeper working for me. My income was about 70% more than I made working for Brad. I had completely forgotten about it, but eventually, Brad's company negotiated a settlement of the wrongful termination lawsuit. Tom thought I should expect more, but I wanted to get it over with. They paid me $250,000. Although Tom was entitled to a third, I gave him half. The other half I set aside to buy a new place to live and set up an office. The night before the 18th month, I announced my intentions while the children were with their mother. Darla, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, I began, as sadness descended on me. You saved me when I thought I was going to lose Mark and Glenda. I know it was very hard, but it was a lifesaver for me. Our contract expires tomorrow, so I found a place to rent temporarily until I buy a house. And hopefully, it won't be a big deal if I keep using the den for another month since I haven't signed a lease for office space yet. Hopefully, by next week, it will be ready. I don't know what reaction I was expecting, perhaps relief, but I didn't expect what I got. Darla burst into tears and ran off to her bedroom. I was stunned and didn't know what to do. I tried knocking on her door, but Darla didn't answer. When I went to bed that night, I was overcome with deep anxiety. Even though Darla and I were married, we had never had intimacy. There was no doubt that I cared for her and cared deeply. She was everything Jenny wasn't. But the entire time I lived in her house, I was afraid of offending her, so I kept my distance, except for the occasional hug or kiss on the cheek. We went our separate ways. I talked to her in the mornings, sometime around midnight. However, a violent thunderstorm broke out. Lightning bolts struck very close to the house. One struck particularly close, shaking the house and waking me up. A few seconds later, my bedroom door swung open and Darla slipped in. Mike, please. I'm terribly afraid of thunderstorms, she whimpered. Can I sleep with you? Sure, I said, lifting the blanket. Shivering, Darla snuggled up against me. It was then I realized she was naked. I'm very afraid of thunder and lightning, she whispered, shivering. I pulled her to me and hugged her. Please, Mike. I know you don't love me, but I need you to make love to me at least once before you leave. At that moment, I realized that I had very deep feelings for Darla. It wasn't the same kind of love I had felt for Jenny. It was a more mature friendship that had grown into something more over the course of 18 months. Making love to Darla that night was the final piece of the puzzle that healed me. "Darla, I don't know if it's love, but I know I never want to leave you," I confessed. At first, I thought we were just friends, but month after month, my feelings for you grew, and for the past few months, I wanted more. But I was afraid you didn't feel the same way. I couldn't risk you kicking me out if I took one step forward. Oh, Mike, I loved you almost from the first time I met you. However, you were married to Jenny, and I knew you were madly in love with her. When she left you, and we came up with the plan to pretend to be married, I thought I had a chance. But today, when you told me you were leaving, I was devastated. I love you so much. I'll be a good wife to you. Please give me a chance. I'll only leave if you kick me out, I kissed her gently. This is my home, and you are my wife from now and forever. 18 months to 10 years after day, after that night with Darla, we woke up to a sunny day without a single cloud in the sky. Suddenly, I had a completely different perspective on my messed up life. I had been through a horrible betrayal, but I had come out of it in a much better situation than I had ever imagined. The pain, anger, and loneliness had been banished. I could now think about Jenny without feeling something clenching my heart. I had finally achieved an opposite love for my ex-wife. Now, I didn't care about her. What had once been a sham marriage was now real and loving. I decided that Darla and I needed to go on our honeymoon. I asked her where she wanted to go to celebrate our final realization that we cared deeply for each other. I expected her to say something like Paris or Hawaii. I wouldn't have been surprised if she had said Las Vegas. But she didn't want to go to either of those cities. Instead, Darla wanted to go to Montana. "Why Montana?" I asked. "My daddy always told me stories about the ranch he worked on in Montana. He loved working there, and it was that experience that made him want to have his own ranch. So when he moved to Texas, he bought the place. Land was a lot cheaper back then. Anyway, I always wanted to see Montana, but I didn't want to go by myself. Why didn't he just buy a ranch in Montana?" I asked. "Because he hated winters. So we spent 2 weeks in Montana, traveling around the state, and even stopped for a week at a working ranch. Darla picked up a lot of ideas for her ranch, but the best part of the trip was the nights we cuddled and explored each other's bodies. The kids were happy to see us when we picked them up. Then they told me something that made me sad. Jenny and Brad had flown to Eastern Europe because Brad was opening 4 new factories in 3 different countries. While they were gone, they hired a nanny to watch Glenda and Mark. The children were unhappy with being looked after by a 50-year-old nanny who wouldn't let them do anything but go to school, do their homework, and watch a little TV. The nanny couldn't swim, so they couldn't even use the pool. When Jenny picked up the kids 2 weeks later, I asked her about it. "Jenny, the kids told me that you and Brad went to Europe and left them with the nanny." "That's none of your business, Mike, so don't start." I held up my hands in a sign of surrender. "I'm not trying to pick a fight. I was just saying that if you have to travel, we'd love to take the kids rather than hire a nanny. We were traveling this time, so we couldn't help. I'm just saying it's an option. The custody agreement is very clear: 2 weeks here at your place and 2 weeks at Brad and my house," Jenny said in a nasty tone, then told the kids to get in the car. The next day, I called Tom and told him about my conversation with Jenny and my proposal. He advised me to wait until they did it again. Perhaps it was just a one-time thing. 6 weeks later, it happened again. I found out about it when I called the kids. Jenny and Brad were away for a week on another trip. At that point, Tom had filed for a modification of the custody agreement. After returning from Europe, Jenny called me and was outraged. She had seen the notice of the hearing to modify the custody agreement. Hell would freeze over before she would agree to any changes to the custody agreement. Tom advised me that the court might very well side with her. However, I told him I wanted to give it a try. Jenny's attorney, Mr. Silas, did not seem too pleased to find himself in court on this issue. I also found it odd that Brad wasn't there, just Jenny. "Your Honor, "This is a waste of the court's time," Mr. Silas said. "The custody agreement has been successful for almost 2 years now. My client sees no reason to change anything." "Your Honor, we're only trying to do what's best for the children," Tom objected, and then laid out his arguments. "We understand that Mr. Carlson has to travel frequently, and it's only natural that he wants his wife to accompany him. All we are asking Mrs. Carlson to do is to allow the children to stay with their father while she is away. And if Mrs. Carlson returns before the 2 weeks are up, the children will be returned to her residence at her convenience." "Miss Silas, do you have anything to add?" The judge looked at him over his glasses. "The custody agreement is working, and Mrs. Carlson would prefer to leave it unchanged." The judge glanced across the 2 tables and back. "Okay, that's easy. Although I agree with Mr. Silas that this particular custody agreement seems to be working well, and I fully understand that Mrs. Carlson will be traveling with her husband on many of these trips, however, it makes no sense to deny the children the company of their father if the mother has to be away. Therefore, I grant Mr. Wilson's motion to modify the custody agreement in accordance with their proposal." I was stunned by the judge's quick decision and even more surprised that he ruled in my favor. But when I saw the cloud of anger looming over Jenny, I knew a storm was coming. "Why are you such a pain in the ass?" Jenny asked me in the hallway after the hearing. "Jenny, I don't know what your problem is, but I'm sick of it." "What's the problem?" "You're not around, so why can't the kids stay with me? From what I've heard, it should be a lot more fun for Glenda and Mark than sitting with that Nazi you hired to babysit them." "Screw you, Mike," she hissed and walked away. "Do you have any idea what her problem is?" I asked Tom. "I can only guess," he replied. "I think Jenny hates not being in control, but more importantly, she's afraid the kids will start to love you more than her." "You're probably right," I agreed with a sigh. "Jenny keeps trying to turn the kids against me, and she always makes me wait 10 or 15 minutes when I pick them up. But I still don't get it. Jenny has everything she wants, so why make such a mockery of it?" "Because she can," Tom said with a smile. "Come buy me lunch." 2 years after that first night Darla and I spent as a real married couple, we had a baby girl we named Wendy. 18 months after that, we had a boy we named Stephen. Darla was not only a wonderful mother, but Glenda was also Glenda's number 2 mom, and Mark became very protective of his new brother and sister. The next 5 years flew by like a blink of an eye, and during that time, I would say I had Mark and Glenda 70% to 80% of the time. Jenny and Brad seemed to be bouncing all over the place after our divorce. Jenny had very little contact with her parents. They visited her and Brad once or twice a year, usually at some restaurant for dinner. Jan and Elma were never invited to any parties at Brad's house, never invited to spend the night at Brad and Jenny's house. On the other hand, Darla and I invited Jan and Elma almost every weekend. The kids loved having them over, and admittedly so did I, because they were like second parents to me. Besides, I loved talking to John about his life. He had found many occupations in his life, from ranch work to truck driving to body repair. He was also one of those who helped build the first World Trade Center. John worked in all phases of construction, doing carpentry, drywall, and electrical work. He could even build the house and pour the foundation. He could do it all. Despite his shortcomings, from time to time John would talk about his service in Vietnam. On those rare occasions when he talked about his war experiences, the wild horses couldn't tear me away from the chair next to him. He was a true American hero. It really bothered me that Jenny ignored her mother and father, and I know it hurt them deeply. I tried to talk to my ex-wife about her attitude toward her parents, but I got her standard response, "Mind your own goddamn business." I continued to follow Jenny and Brad on social pages, as I had gotten into the habit of doing, but the kids liked seeing pictures of their mother in the newspaper too. When we first broke up, I kept a close eye on whether Jenny and Brad's marriage would dissolve, as I was sure it would, but as the years went by, Jenny and Brad seemed very happy, and although I never asked, according to Mark and Glenda, life at Brad's house was pleasant. The kids even liked Brad, and apparently he was nice to them. Well, he bought them tons of stuff, which the kids always love. Sadly, Elma passed away from cancer about 8 years after our divorce. She spent her last days with us at the ranch. There were quite a few people in attendance at the funeral, which was held locally. There is a private cemetery on the ranch dating back to the 1870s, and John asked if we could bury Alma there. We, of course, agreed. J.N. also asked if he could be buried next to her, and again we agreed. I wasn't sure if Jenny would actually come to the funeral because she had only spoken to her father once since her mother's death, and that was when J.N. called his daughter to inform her of her mother's passing. However, Jenny did show up with Brad. She was wearing a dark blue dress and sunglasses. I was a little surprised by Brad's appearance. His hair was starting to thin and gray, and in addition, he had a hint of a potbelly. I figured he was spending too much time traveling, eating out, and not exercising enough. J.N. got up to greet his daughter, and it was an awkward moment. They just stood there looking at each other for what seemed like an eternity until John pulled his daughter into a hug. At first, Jenny just stood there, but then she slowly embraced her father. Brad walked over to John and shook his hand, offering his condolences. Mark and Glenda, who had been crying, walked over and hugged their mother. Brad turned to me, nodded, and smirked. I think he expected me to flinch at his presence. Instead, I smiled, extended my hand, and shook it. When we tried to take a seat in the front pew, there wasn't enough room, so I suggested that Brad and I sit on the second pew. Brad was not happy about this, especially when John insisted that I sit next to him. Darla ended up taking my place in the second pew with Brad. As the service began, I heard Brad grumbling behind me. Then I heard Darla hiss something at him. A moment later, Brad got up and left. When it was over, John invited Jenny and Brad to come back to the ranch for the burial and subsequent meal, but Jenny declined, making the excuse that she had a plane to catch. I knew it was a lie, but I didn't say anything. After the funeral service, I caught Darla alone and asked what had happened between her and Brad during the church service. He was mad because you were sitting in the front row with his wife, Darla said, shaking her head. But I sat on one side of John, and Jenny sat on the other. We didn't sit together. I pointed that out to the high and mighty Mr. Carlson and then told him to shut up because the world doesn't revolve around him, Darla said, smiling mischievously. I think he was insulted. We laughed about the incident, but we shouldn't have. Brad doesn't react well to people who don't show him proper deference. In other words, he's a vindictive prick who truly believes his doesn't stink. 2 weeks later, Brad began another land grab on Darla's ranch. This time, he claimed 10 acres of land adjacent to his allotment. His attorneys found out that those 10 acres had once been a separate parcel, and because of a clerical error, they were not included in the single ownership of the rest of the ranch. Therefore, taxes had never been assessed on those 10 acres. Brad had his accountants calculate what the taxes on those 10 acres should have been and paid the county that amount. His attorneys then demanded a tax return. Darla was upset by this demand, even though the 10 acres were a mixture of swampy and rocky land. Darla asked me if she should just sign the deed since the land wasn't worth that much. Absolutely not, I immediately replied. Brad is being a bully and trying to put you in your place for insulting him. You didn't have the money to fight him last time. It's time to shove him up your ass and end the relationship. His claims are phony. As I predicted, the court sided with Darla. They said it was the county's fault that the taxes on the 10 acres weren't collected. Furthermore, it was the county's responsibility to first notify the current owner and give him an opportunity to pay the delinquent bill. And to top it all off, the court limited the tax payment period to 5 years. After that, I didn't see Brad in person for a long time. I saw him and Jenny on social media pages from time to time. During that same period, I rarely saw Jenny. More often than not, when I came to pick up the kids, one or the other staff member was already ready and waiting for me at the front door. And that was fine. In addition, Jenny continued to miss spending time with the kids as Brad traveled more and more. As the years went on, I estimated that the kids stayed with me about 9 months out of the year. It was getting to the point where they hated going back to their mother's house and Brad's house. They complained that Brad had become moody, and their mother was almost always absent. Then, there was a scoop in the newspaper. Brad had filed for divorce from Jenny. It was a complete shock to me, and I couldn't understand why. The kids were just as confused as I was. But a few weeks passed, and it was revealed that Brad had caught Jenny cheating with billionaire Thad Dion. That explanation spoke for itself. Jenny was changing once again. Thad was not only richer than Brad, but he was also considerably younger. Darla and I couldn't help but be amused by this turn of events. Shortly after Brad and Jenny's divorce was finalized, Jenny married Thad. To me, this was a wonderful thing. Thad didn't live in the Chesterton School District, so for practical purposes, Glenda and Mark lived with me and Darla all the time. Shortly after Elma died, I convinced John to sell his house and move in with us. Since John knew all about construction, Darla hired him to do renovations on the ranch. Then Darla and I decided to expand the house to make a dining room for the ranch workers and expand my bookkeeping. This caused another fight with Brad. He fought to have our building permit denied. In the end, we got the permit because we had great rights of way. John took charge of the new construction and did about 85% of the work himself. It was a little over a year after Thad and Jenny's wedding, and Jenny filed for divorce. There were rumors that Jenny had caught Thad cheating on her with an 18-year-old girl. Then there was another rumor that I later found out was true. Thad only married Jenny because he didn't like Brad and decided to take his wife away from him. Talk about karma. I get up every morning and thank God for all the blessings He has bestowed upon me. From 10 years to 30 years after DD Day, the years went by, and we had our ups and downs. One terrible tragedy struck when Mark was in a car accident that could have killed him. However, he was lucky. He suffered a broken leg and wrist, as well as bruises, scrapes, and cuts. John suffered a mild stroke that left him slightly paralyzed on his left side. Physical therapy helped him, and he now walks with only a slight limp. Darla never seems to get sick. She told me she doesn't have time to be sick with 4 kids, the ranch, and me. I, on the other hand, have been very lucky. I hadn't been feeling well for weeks. I had no energy and was plagued by headaches and nausea. I kept brushing it off until one day Darla took my hand and dragged me to the doctor's office. After a bunch of tests, they determined that I had one artery so badly clogged that I was about to have a heart attack. I was operated on and had a triple bypass. After the surgery, even though I was still in a hospital bed, I couldn't believe how much better I felt. If you're wondering if I ever thought about going back to Jenny after she became single, the answer is hell no. The thought hadn't crossed my mind until Darla mentioned it one night after dinner as we were watching TV. The thought crossed my mind, and Darla asked me, "Have you ever thought about getting back together with Jenny?" Darla tried to make it sound casual, but I could see the fear in her eyes. One day, I saw an old man sitting in the waiting room, and I went to see what I could do to help him. When he looked up, I was shocked. It was Brad. "Brad, this is a surprise," I said, holding out my hand. Brad took my hand and shook it weakly. He looked unimpressed, but before I could say anything, he spoke. "You won," he said sadly. "I won what?" I asked in confusion. "I really loved her," Brad said, "and I thought she really loved me." And then it hit me that he was talking about Jenny. So I suggested, "Yes, she has a way of making you fall in love with her, but Jenny has always had one big flaw. She was born poor and never got over it." "Now I understand how you felt when Jenny left you," Brad admitted. "How did you survive?" I asked. "One day at a time and with the help of a loving woman," he answered honestly. "There is no magic cure." Brad sighed. "It's too late for me to find someone else. Besides, I love Jenny with all my heart. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I have stage 4 cancer, and I wanted to apologize to you. I knew it was wrong to pursue a married woman, but I just fell in love with Jenny. I hope that someday you can forgive me." Looking at the old man standing in front of me, it struck me that I had once hated him with my whole being. But now, I just felt sorry for him. "Brad, there was a time when I hated you," I admitted, "but that time is long gone, and if you want my forgiveness, you will get it." He smiled sadly again, thanked me, and left. He died 5 months later. Darla and I attended the service. I was surprised at how few people showed up. However, Jenny was among those in attendance. She was very upset about Brad's passing and even more upset with me. "You had to come and gloat, didn't you?" Jenny pounced on me. "You couldn't let me bury him in peace. You wanted everyone to see that you'd won." I was furious. "You're a hypocrite. You left him for someone with a lot of money, and now you're crying crocodile tears over his death. Brad apologized to me months ago, and I accepted his apology. Have you ever apologized to Brad for setting him up?" I didn't wait for an answer. I took Darla's hand, and we left. The drive home was quiet for a while, but then Darla turned to me and asked, "Who pooped in your crispy crumbs this morning?" I couldn't help myself and burst into laughter. Darla always had a way of making me laugh. When Brad's will became public, I was surprised. He left most of his fortune to charity and his alma mater, but he also left $2 million to Jenny. Jenny, who had received from 2 wealthy husbands, and this latest inheritance was doing just fine. She bought an apartment near the ranch and tried to reconnect with her children. However, the children did not want to go to their mother's house. Since it was designed for middle-aged single people, they complained that there was nothing for them to do there. But I told them that their mother was making an effort, and they should too. In the end, the distance proved to be too great. Eventually, Jenny gave up and found a new boyfriend. From then on, Jenny changed boyfriends like people change socks. The kids seemed happy that they didn't have to spend time at their mother's house, and if they were happy, I was happy. I was very proud of our kids. Mark graduated from Georgia Institute of Technology with a degree in engineering. He works and lives in Austin. He married a lovely girl from Ohio, Cindy Stubben, whom he met at GT. She is also an engineer, and they work at the same firm. They have 2 beautiful daughters, and Cindy works from home. Glenda attended Texas A&M University to become a veterinarian. After graduation, Glenda moved home and worked for local veterinarian Sam Turner for several years. She then separated and opened her own practice. About a year later, a young veterinarian named Todd Amberson bought out Sam's practice. I guess it was inevitable, but Glenda and Todd ended up merging the 2 practices and merged their lives when they married. They have 2 boys and a little girl, and I swear, my grandchildren spend more time at the ranch than they do in their own home. Not only do Darla and I love having them around, but Jenny's dad probably spends more time with the kids than anyone else. They just adore him. My daughter Elma graduated from the University of Texas with a teaching degree. She now teaches 3rd grade at Chesterton Elementary School. She married her college boyfriend Jerry, who teaches at Marion Middle School. He's a chemistry teacher. In 3 months, give or take a few days, they are expecting their first child. I couldn't be happier because I adore grandchildren. They are better than your own children, I'm kidding, but grandchildren have a lot to say. You can spoil them to your heart's content, and when they get cranky and fussy, you give them back. Mark married a beautiful girl he met while on vacation in England. No, she wasn't English, she was just another American on vacation. Her name is Sally. She's 5 feet tall with long, dark black hair and violet eyes. I tease her by saying she's a mini Elizabeth Taylor. They have 3 children, 2 boys, and a girl, and we just found out she's pregnant with a 4th. It amazes me that Sally has no problem carrying these children, being as small as she is. The years continued to rush by, and before I knew it, Darla and I celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary. For the past few years, I have rarely seen Jenny. The kids have occasional contact with their mother, but they rarely see her from what they tell me. Time has begun to catch up with their mom, as it has with all of us. She's no longer the hot commodity she used to be, and apparently, she hasn't had a boyfriend in years. Jenny called her dad once every 2 months or so. He was approaching 90, but he still moved around fine and was still as alert as a glass. Conversations between father and daughter were always pretty short, and John always remained a little depressed. When I once asked him why he didn't talk to Jenny longer, he admitted that he just didn't know what to say to her. I felt sad for John. Another Christmas was fast approaching, and I headed to the mall for some Christmas shopping. I have long ago admitted that I'm absolutely terrible at picking out gifts, so I just find out what stores my family likes to shop at, then I go there and buy gift cards. I know it sounds so lame, but that way, I can never buy the wrong thing, size, or color, and so far, I haven't gotten a single complaint. Anyway, I had just bought my last card, and I was hungry, so I headed to the food court to order a Chick-fil-A sandwich and a lemonade. I was just about to take my first bite when I recognized the woman sitting 2 tables away from me. It was Jenny. She sat alone and watched the people passing by. She was especially interested in the families that filled the mall. Jenny was no longer the beauty I'd married. She had gained about 15 pounds and had a few wrinkles. Even from where I was sitting, the age spots on her arms were visible. Still, she was attractive for her age, but it was the loneliness in her eyes that caught my attention. I decided I wasn't going to hesitate and go sit with her. "Hey, mind if I join you?" I asked, placing my sandwich and drink on the table. "What do you want?" snapped Jenny. I was surprised by her hostility. It took me a moment to realize it, but then I picked up my sandwich and drink. "I don't need anything. I just wanted to say hi. Look, I'm sorry for bothering you. I don't want to start a fight, so I'll just find another table." A look of pain appeared on Jenny's face, and she flinched slightly. "No, I'm really sorry. The holidays seem to bring out the worst in me. Please, have a seat. I want to have some company." "What brings you to the mall? Christmas shopping?" I asked, taking a bite out of my chicken sandwich. "Mike, I haven't done any Christmas shopping since Brad and I got divorced. Now, I just send checks, and the kids really appreciate them, especially the ones for the grandkids. They put that money into college funds." "I know," Jenny replied as she watched a young couple wheel the baby stroller past. "They tell me about it in thank you notes. So, back to the original question, what brought you to the mall? As I recall, you didn't really care about shopping in general. If you needed something, you went to the store, bought it, and went home." "I just wanted to be around people," Jenny replied absent-mindedly, watching a young couple who were trying to get their 3 children around the table. "Everyone in my house is separated for the vacations. And what are you going to do for Christmas? You're not going to sit in your apartment alone, are you?" "Of course not," Jenny replied. "I have reservations at Chez Francesca, and then I plan to watch the new movie with Tom Hanks." "No, you're not going to do that," I said, finishing my sandwich. "You're coming to the ranch for Christmas. Your kids and grandkids will be there, and your dad's going to be there too. It'll be fun." "I can't do that," Jenny protested. "I'll be an inconvenience to everyone." "Nonsense," I said, picking up my trash. "It's settled that you're coming." Then, as I was leaving, I looked back and said, "If you want to see the grandchildren open their presents, you'd better be there by 7 in the morning. But come whenever you want, dinner will be served at 3. Darla wasn't too pleased when I told her Jenny could come for Christmas. "Why did you invite her?" she asked, jealousy and uncertainty flashing in her eyes. I quickly pulled my wife into a hug and kissed her. "Is it my wife who's jealous?" "Stop it, Mike." "I'm serious," Darla said, her eyes blazing. "She's going to make everyone feel awkward," that's what Jenny said when she tried to get out of it. But I couldn't let her spend the day alone in my apartment. "What's up with Jenny?" asked John, entering the room. "I invited Jenny to join us for Christmas," I said to the man I considered my second father, "and she said she was coming." John's eyes lit up, and I could see that Darla had noticed it too. "Not exactly," I explained. Jenny tried to excuse herself because she felt it would make everyone uncomfortable, but I didn't take no for an answer. Whether she comes or not is still up to her. The light of happiness in John's eyes faded, but it was quickly replaced by a look of hope. On Christmas Day, Jenny didn't come to watch the grandchildren open presents, nor did she show up for dinner at 3 o'clock. By then, I had already realized she wasn't coming, and apparently John thought the same. He looked downcast and sat quietly by himself. I felt sorry for him and eventually sent my youngest granddaughter, Christy, who was 4 years old, to him to play her game, as I knew he would. He was soon sitting on the floor playing Candyland. Around 5:30, I was surprised to hear the front doorbell ring. Opening the door, I was surprised to find Jenny. She was dressed as if she was going out to dinner. "Hi," I said kindly. "I was beginning to lose hope for you." "I still think it might be a mistake," she said, uncertainty in her eyes. "No, not at all," I assured her. "You missed dinner, but we're going to serve dessert pretty soon. But if you want to eat something, I can heat up a plate of leftovers for you." "No, dessert sounds lovely," Jenny said as I walked her inside. "Hey, guys and gals," I addressed everyone in the family room, "look who I found. Jenny's here for dessert." The grandkids pounced on her, and the whole pack began picking teams for some game, all wanting Jenny on their team. Mark and Glenda came over and hugged and kissed their mom, wishing her a Merry Christmas. In fact, all the kids hugged her. However, to my surprise, Darla also hugged and kissed Jenny. The evening went very pleasantly. Jenny was very nervous at first and seemed to weigh everything she was told. But when she finally realized that she was the only one who was uncomfortable, she began to relax. It was touching to see Jenny and her father sitting together, talking and laughing. All in all, it was a very enjoyable Christmas. Although Jenny had calmed down since her arrival, it was obvious that she was still unsure about being in Darla's and my house. And I have to admit, I did study Jenny from time to time. She was still an attractive woman, but I was amazed that I had no feelings for her other than the fact that she was the mother of my 2 children. After the grandchildren had settled down, their parents decided to use the hot tub since it was 34 degrees outside. It was of no interest to Darla, Jenny, or me. John decided to give it a try but came back after a few minutes, saying that you'd have to be crazy to sit in a tub, even if it was heated, at a temperature below 30. Anyway, I got us all drinks, and we sat down around the fireplace with the Christmas tree blinking away. For 15 minutes, we sat in silence, watching the flames dancing around the logs. At one point, I noticed tears streaming down Jenny's face. "Are you okay?" I asked, not realizing what the tears were for. "I'll be fine," Jenny replied in a thin voice, wiping away the tears. Neither Darla nor I said anything about the tears and let the silence surround us again. After another 5 minutes, Jenny spoke up. "I almost didn't come," Jenny said, looking at the fire. "I was afraid I'd find out what I already pretty much knew. I made a big mess of my life." "Oh, I think you're being too hard on yourself," Darla marveled. "I saw pictures of you and Brad, and it was clear you loved him. And I'd say the same thing about Thad. Neither marriage worked out, but 50% of all marriages end in divorce anyway. Oh, my affection for Brad burgeoned initially, though, Mike, my love for you endured. Yet, his wealth and influence captivated me more deeply. We shared a semblance of harmony for years, until I allowed him to drive a wedge between me and my children. With a significant age gap of 15 years between us, Brad's advancing years brought health issues that impeded his prowess in the bedroom. Frustration and anger consumed him, mirroring the pain and resentment I once witnessed in your eyes, Mike. About 6 months before I embarked on a relationship with Thad, I began to stray. The same agony and disdain that colored Brad's gaze now emanated from Thad's eyes, leaving me shattered. He confessed his disdain for Brad, citing a grudge over a business deal as his motive for marrying me. The revelation left me reeling, finally grasping the anguish you and Brad endured. Upon freeing myself from Thad's grip, I renounced the institution of marriage, indulging in loveless affairs fueled by wealth and freedom. It was Jenny's feeble attempt at penance. Following a brief silence, Jenny emptied her glass and rose to her feet. "I must leave," she uttered. Despite Darla, John, and my attempts to persuade her to stay the night, she remained resolute. John and I escorted her to the car, her father enveloping her in a tight embrace, professing his love. Jenny's tears flowed anew, swiftly wiped away as she embraced me tightly, expressing gratitude before departing. The future remains uncertain to me. I sense Jenny harbors genuine remorse for her past decisions. Whether she chooses to reconcile with her family lies solely within her hands. The house, now enveloped in silence, save for the occasional crackle from the fireplace, evoked a pang of sympathy for my ex-wife's sorrow. As for myself, I harbored regrets for the time squandered plotting vengeance against Jenny and Brad. Seated by the flickering flames, the biblical verse resurfaced in my mind: not for the swift run, not for the strong fight, not for the wise food, not for the brilliant riches, not for the learned favor, but time and chance happen to all. Time, it seemed, delivered its own form of retribution. Thank you for joining me. I hope you found this narrative engaging. Remember to subscribe to my channel for future content.